Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Cross Country Super Podcast. And of course, I'm joined by Jemma Sanderson over in beautiful Perth, WA. How are you, Jemma? It's great to see you.
Good to see you too, Darin. I'm well, and actually, it is a cracking day today. It's that time of the year. It's my favourite, like beautiful and sunny, but not too hot. So yeah, gotta love
Maybe
Perth for that weather. Hey,
we're supposed to be having thunderstorms this afternoon, so we'll see what happens. It's still relatively sunny outside, but Sydney's weather has been turning quite quickly on a dime. Quite in a quite volatile fashion. So we'll see what happens, see whether or not we get any violent storms. And of course, this podcast is brought to you by our sponsor. Need a current or retrospective SMSF property valuation? Whether it's for annual financial statements, pension commencement, or related party transactions, SMSF Property Valuations offers fast, reliable, and audit-ready reports across Australia. As an accountant or SMSF trustee, do you need a valuation that satisfies the ATO rules, includes documented methodology, and ticks all audit boxes? SMSF Property Valuations delivers an easy online ordering process to finish the job quickly. And thank you, of course, to SMSF Property Valuations for their continued support. And as I say, I can't emphasize enough how important getting your valuations right is going to be. And of course, in light of the imminent Division 296 tax, that will be even more important to get right.
absolutely.
Anyway, we're going to get stuck into today's topic, and I'm sorry, it's not very uplifting. We're going to talk about our continued conversation about death and death benefits. Yeah, I know. We'll try and make it as exciting as we possibly can, but we're going to cover some of the, I don't know, more intricate details, probably raise a few questions, and maybe some of the concepts that don't necessarily immediately spring to mind when you're talking about what to do with death benefits and how to treat them. It's not that simple, is it, Jemma?
It's not. There's lots of ins and outs that we need to be aware of, and in our previous sessions, we've spoken about the tax position for the beneficiaries, and so today we're going to talk about some of the areas that the fund itself needs to be and the trustees need to be aware of, and the considerations along the way there.
Well, on that note, we're going to start off pretty basically and then peel the layers of the onion back and get into more sort of technical detail as the conversation continues.
Yep.
So the first thing we want to cover off is the decision by the fund, whoever's controlling the fund at the time, as to which assets do you keep and which assets do you have to sell or offload in order to meet the death benefit payment obligations that you will find yourself under, unfortunately, when a member dies.
Yeah, it's an interesting discussion that we have with clients when they're considering. So someone's died and an amount has to come out of the fund. So they've looked at maximising the ECPI with transfer balance cap considerations and pension commencements or continuations, but a chunk has to come out. So what assets do you keep? What assets do you transfer out? And so it's often not a matter of, so you could have your blinkers on and say, well, what's best for the fund? The fund's got to consider, I've got to make pension payments every year. What's the profile of those assets? Are they growth assets? So when they're ultimately sold, I'm going to get a 0% tax rate or a much better tax rate in the fund? Or do I look at those income producing assets because that'll give me that liquidity to pay those benefits? And if there's a nice big chunky pension account in there, then you're going to have the ongoing benefits of doing that. So that's one consideration. The other one is always, what does the investment strategy say? Making sure that that all aligns. And then when you've got really chunky assets in there like business real property or farming land, sometimes that's a succession consideration for the survivors. So it might be that the spouse is the continuing, well, if they can continue the fund, they've got their own account in there, perhaps a reversionary or new pension, and there's a big commercial property in there. So what were the intentions of the family when one of the members of the couple or the fund died? Is that to go out of the fund? Who's getting it? How are they receiving that directly, or is it via the estate or via a testamentary trust? All of those considerations. And then what's left behind? Is that going to be enough to provide for the income? Is it the case that it's going to be a proportionate ownership of one of those assets? So part of the property gets transferred out to facilitate the death benefit payment, and part remains in the fund to with that tenants in common ownership. So it's not as easy decision. Sometimes people might be like, ugh, Barley's too hard to decide which assets why don't we just sell a whole chunk of them, pay it out in cash, and then, plod along from there. So it's even that in itself is not necessarily a straightforward decision. And then if you overlay that with, if you've got elderly clients and one member of the couple dies, and then you've got the children, say, managing the fund for the survivor because the survivor's lost capacity, what are the considerations there? It might be even more difficult for the family to consider what to keep and what to pay out and all that sort of stuff. So it just adds that layer of complexity to an already challenging time or the survivor or the family to be navigating through.
Yeah, it's an interesting situation that trustees or whoever's controlling the fund after the member dies find themselves in because, it's obviously, as you mentioned, a very, emotionally upsetting event, and
Mm,
and you've got a lot on your mind, obviously, when someone passes away, but it can't be ignored that the fundamental functioning of the SMSF, if there are remaining members to it, um, they can't be ignored, and they
that's
they
right.
must continue in perpetuity. So even while I don't want to refer to death as a blip, but it's almost like a blip in the management of the fund, where in this instance you've got to make these decisions, but you've also got to continue on how the fund operates with
Mm.
all of the other obligations that it has, um,
For the
moving into the
benefits of the
future. Yeah,
members.
for the
Yeah.
for the for the remaining members. That's a tough thing to weigh up, isn't it?
Well, yeah, that's exactly right. So you're looking at, okay, which assets to keep, which to pay out, how much has to be paid out. And then that's before you're even overlaying, well, what are the tax implications of that in the fund? So you might know there's death benefits tax to pay, perhaps, depending on if it might be that that death benefit is being directed to adult children or to the estate where there'll be ultimate non-death benefits dependents beneficiaries. So that's one element. But then at the fund level, if you are going to transfer an asset out of that fund or sell it, that's a capital gains tax event. And
Yeah.
so the consideration there is also what are the tax implications at the fund level. And some people might be thinking, oh, well, dad's died, he was in pension phase, and so that's going to be exempt from tax, but that's not necessarily how that's going to work. And so some of the decision making, even on which investment, might also be determined by what the tax position of that asset is from a capital gains tax perspective. But then sometimes people don't necessarily consider that exempt current pension income position. And it's not just at the time the asset is paid out. So, as an example, we'll do a mum and dad fund. They've both got $4 million sitting in there. I'm trying to do something that's easy for my brain on a Friday when we're recording this. So easy for my brain. So dad's died. He had $2 million in pension and $2 million in accumulation. And likewise, mum had $2 million in pension and $2 million in accumulation. So in the lead up to death, it's a 50-50 accumulation pension fund. And then you've got the situation of, okay, well, a new pension is started for mum or a reversionary pension, and she has to then restructure her own account. So you've got the situation that 2 million of dad's account can stay in there for mum, and you've got 2 million that has to come out as a death benefit lump sum payment. Now, depending on the timing of when all of that happens, so the requirements in the SIS regulations is that you've got to pay that out as soon as practicably. You've got to deal with a death benefit. And so that can be starting a pension or a reversionary pension being in place. And then you've got the requirement is an interim and then a final lump sum. So really a maximum of 2 lump sums. And we'll come to later about how that is incredibly impractical and where that all comes from. But anyway, so you've got to pay out a lump sum here of $2 million. Now, where that gets paid out, let's say that gets paid out at a similar time to mum restructuring her accounts to also then receive that dad's pension account. So she's gone from having a $2 million pension and a $2 million accumulation to having a $2 million pension and then $4 million in accumulation account, which is her own pension reverted back to accumulation and receiving dad's pension. So that's where that's gone. And then $2 million gets exited out of the fund as a lump sum payment. Now, at that time, if there's a capital gains tax of like it could be $1 million worth of realized capital gain as a result of that, then the consideration there is, well, what's left over in the fund is going to be 1/3 pension, 2/3 accumulation. Prior to that time of payment, it was 50-50. So you're going to have in the lead up to the time of that payment, say 50-50. And then from then, you're going to have 1/3 pension, 2/3 accumulation. Now those different proportions are going to apply to a proportion of the financial year itself. So there's quite a lot so if you make that payment quite early in the financial year, you might have 50-50 over the course of July, and then you've got 1/3 pension, 2/3 accumulation for the remaining 11 months of the year. So 11/12 of that capital gain will be 1/3 pension, 2/3 accumulation, and 1/12 will be 50-50. And I've just really hurt my brain talking about it in that way. And I was trying to use easy numbers. So you can see, hopefully, then that because of what's left over in that situation has a substantial impact on the CGT position of what is paid out earlier on in that year. Now, if you flip that around and have it 50-50 for the bulk of the year, and then it's 1/3, 2/3, or you try and manage it so it's a 1 July payment or a 30 June payment, so you get your 50-50, then, all of those sorts of things can factor into then the ECPI over the course of that whole year impacts the CGT on the transfer of that asset. And this is also a reason why there's a lot of leftovers that happen in funds, because if that all happened on that whatever day it was, and you're thinking, okay, well, that's 50-50 and it's 2/3, 1/3, 2/3 beyond, then calculating the actual CGT on the assets to come out, which then determines the balance to be paid out, there's always adjustments that need to be made. And you've got to be really careful with that. If, let's say, so I've had situations where dad has died and it's dad and the 3 kids in the fund, and the 3 kids are all well under preservation age. So we've got to absolutely nail the value of dad's benefit and the CGT on that to be paid out, because if we don't, then we might have paid out too much. And then if we've paid out too much, then that's a breach of the payment standards. So that in itself is a challenging consideration for funds.
Yeah, no, as you mentioned, it's not straightforward. And while you mentioned sort of nice, neat timeframes, I suppose you could say, to make it a little bit easier, you can't really manipulate the time frame either, because as soon as practicable, boy, that's a hard word
It's
to
a tongue
say,
twister, that one. Yeah.
um, is not to suggest that you can just make the time frame suit whatever makes it easier. I know, we've probably discussed this before, that they got rid of the suggestion that the rule of thumb is 6 months for that now. That's gone now, but it doesn't mean that, you know, you can totally take the PISS out of
Yeah, and push it.
out
Oh,
of the
let's
situation and
make it
just say
two
that, oh,
years.
Gemma,
No,
why don't we do this? Like
yeah.
if I can pay it out, on the 30th of June or the 1st of July that benefits all of us, why don't we just do that? But if it's not, like if you can't prove that it's as soon as practicable by doing that, you can't, like you can't justify it by with those sort of considerations, can
Mm,
you? As much as
that's
we'd
right.
love to, because it might make our lives a little bit easier, you
Much
can't do
easier.
that. The ATO will be all over you like a cheap suit, as they say in the classics.
Well, and I think you're right that as soon as practicably was it, there was a 6 month, and 6 months as a rule of thumb isn't a bad consideration. The tax office had said that their expectations were it was paid out within 6 months, but that has never been a hard and fast. The 6 month rule, digressing as we like to do, is purely on the trusteeship of the fund. That's the only absolute 6 month rule. There used to be other 6 month rules, but then those rules changed, some time ago. The other consideration is like, so if my mum and dad, they've both died and dad's died and he's got his pension and his accumulation, people center on the pension account and what has to happen with that. Is it reversionary or not? Is a new pension commenced? If it's reversionary, then you've got your 12 months. If it's not reversionary, you still get the ECPI until the time that the benefit is otherwise dealt with. But the accumulation is still something that has to be dealt with as soon as practicably. So if I revert back to those, like my 50-50 and my one third, two thirds, if you're in that realm where you could perhaps deal with the payment out of the lump sum as soon, like early, because you can land on an asset, there's cash in there to pay it out, you can get pretty close, then you could look at dealing with that. And if it's a reversionary pension, you've still got 12 months where you're getting the benefit of both pensions from that perspective. So if we could flip it around and say, right, well, dad's $2 million pension and mum's $2 million pension, they continue on, and we've got a mum's accumulation. So mum doesn't have to restructure for a bit, and dad's accumulation gets paid out early in the year, then you could have a two-third pension, one-third accumulation for a larger chunk of the year rather than it being 50-50. So it's managing all of that. But of course, the sooner you can deal with some of these, the better, or be aware of it. And if someone dies particularly unexpectedly, then this is the last thing that's going to be on their radar on, oh, I have to do this and this and this in the super fund to save some capital gains tax, or to consider how that's going to flow out. So just, yeah, there's an awareness thing there. The other one that I've also seen where there can be issues is, and no doubt people have got the flavour that I don't really like children being in their parents' SMSFs. And another one where this can come a cropper is, let's say dad dies, mum might still be in the fund, and benefits get paid out of the fund. And say the family decides, okay, well, there's inheritances are happening to the kids. Let's get the kids to join the fund and they can make their non-concessional contribution. All of a sudden, you've got non-concessional contributions going into the fund, their accumulation accounts, they're going to again skew that ECPI proportion over the course of the year, and therefore that could not be the best outcome. Again, I'm talking here about those funds where you've got to take that actuarial approach to ECPI. There's not the opportunity to land on it being segregated for tax purposes with the ECPI calculation there either. So it's just one of those areas to be aware of, because it all then feeds through to what the actual lump sum payment is, that death benefit that gets paid out, and then even the death benefits tax, if there is any that might arise because of that payment.
Yeah, I noticed something in your examples there, Jim. Well, two things really. Number one, the guy always dies first. And
No, no.
you're not the only one that does that. But
Statistically,
yeah,
statistically, the
yeah,
blokes
that's
die
right.
first.
Life expectancy is shorter
Yeah.
for guys. And I do another podcast with Tracy Besters, and she hates having children in the fund as well. She doesn't
Yeah.
like them either. And as I keep saying, I'm bucking the trend because I am in a super fund with my mother. So hopefully I can be the outlier that doesn't
The
prove
exception
all of your,
to the
yes,
rule.
that
Yeah.
doesn't prove all of your misgivings true.
Sometimes
Believe me, I'm
it's not a
really
bad
conscious of that.
outcome, but it's again, it's just awareness from that perspective. But back to your previous comment, statistically, the husband or the male dies before
Yeah.
the female.
Isn't it the average life expectancy is 82 for males and 84 for women? It's
Yeah,
something along those lines.
something like
Something.
that.
I
Yeah.
just think it's
And
funny how the
again,
bloke gets killed off first.
and again, these are statistics, and then statistically, often the male is older than the female. And so then if they die at 82 or they die at 75 and their wife is younger, then their wife might live for another 10 odd years or whatever. Anyway, again, we
Yeah, not
digress as we
not too many
do love to
Emmanuel
do.
Macrons in the SMSF world, I think. Isn't his wife
No.
significantly older than he is, isn't she? I
Or,
think.
there was Deborah Lee Furness and Hugh Jackman. She was quite a bit
Oh yeah,
older,
okay. I didn't
but they're,
realize there was a huge age gap between those two, but anyway.
I think
As I say, as you say, we digress. I
they're
just wanted
divorced now,
to.
so it's a bit irrelevant. Yeah.
It's a moot point now.
Moot point. Moot point.
Um, uh, just on you mentioned the investment strategy really, really briefly when we start talking about, which assets to offload and which ones do you keep in the fund. With that sort of consciousness, are you talking about whether or not there's any percentages or anything involved there? I know that's not necessarily a great way to go, but we know a lot of investment strategies have investment bands in them.
Yep.
So are those the sorts of things from an investment strategy point of view that if you're going to have to offload assets or do something along those lines, that you have to be conscious of?
Yeah, so that's one of the elements, obviously, if it's got those bands in there, and then you're like, right, let's just get rid of that. Let's just transfer out that commercial property or the business real property, or it could be residential property that's been that's been sitting in there for a while. So transferring that out, and then what is the requirements of the investment strategy? Does it need to be updated? Have we? So the investment strategy requires the consideration of all of those elements: risk and return, liquidity, ability to meet the liabilities of the fund, etc. So it's just making sure that that isn't dismissed. And if you have a look at the merchant case, the investment strategy not being considered at all in that particular transaction, it was that was a big no-no. So it's just another element for people to be factoring in. And the other thing that comes about with all of this as well is if someone dies and there is a property in there and it's got an LRBA, like how does that all fit in with the scheme of it all as well? So there is an element of some complexity in there. And I've spoken about capital gains tax. The other thing with that is if it is property that's being moved, where is it located? Is it being paid directly to beneficiaries, or is it going to the estate? So the context of that is what are the stamp duty implications depending on the relevant state that the person is in. If they receive a property direct, let's say one of the kids gets the property direct, then so I'm in good old Perth, WA. We've got a stamp duty concession that enables a transfer out of a super fund to the estate or to a beneficiary, and it's eligible for nominal duty. But then you've got to consider, well, if that goes directly to Jimmy and Jimmy's got other property in his own name, what are then the landholder duty implications, etc.? So it's not just I've got to transfer out $2 million worth of assets. Which ones are they? The which ones are they is, okay, we've got to consider this and this and this, and just a lot more comes under the umbrella for those considerations.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the merchant case because that almost does emphasize the fact of looking at a macro perspective, not necessarily from a Part 4A tax avoidance scheme
Mm.
thing that case brought up. But nevertheless, you have to look at the whole of tax situation for the client and whoever the beneficiary might be, because all of a sudden their situation completely changes.
Mm,
I always found
absolutely.
it amusing in the merchant case that no review of the investment strategy was made, and there was no allowance for holding property in the fund, and yet the fund held the property, and that
I
was for a
know. It
long
was,
time. That was for a
yeah.
long time. It
That
wasn't
was I
like,
think
oh, just
even
I bought
before
it
the
yesterday.
previous change. Yeah. It was quite it was anyway, we already did two podcasts on merchant.
Yes,
I
we
don't think
did,
people
but
want to
it's
hear us
just
talk about merchant again. But
but it's
again, though,
just
what
that
we learn from it
yeah,
and how
yeah,
it flows out. So
yeah.
that's
And
definitely a big one.
I think it's also good to emphasize that, if you tell people about a situation like that, they might say, oh, come on, Gemma, as if that would happen. If it's not in the investment strategy, how can you go out and buy one of those assets? Well, guess what? In real life, it did happen. I'm
In real
sorry.
life it happens.
So,
Yeah.
as you say, these are the lessons that we have to learn from real case studies, real court cases, real actions, and hopefully don't repeat the mistakes that unfortunately other people may have made.
And I think it's one of those things where, like, do you have a checklist on dealing with a death benefit in a super fund? What might that look like? What are the things you need to consider? And often, and I guess one of the reasons why we have this podcast is to get in front of anyone that might be advising a self-managed fund. So whether you are the trustee, but invariably, I guess this is targeted at the advisors to funds. So you could be the financial advisor and you could be chatting to the trustee and they're saying, right, let's just transfer these shares out. Can you handle that for me, Darin? Off market transfer forms, all of that sort of stuff. We'll transfer them out and it'll be a death benefit. So that you might ferret in there and like do as instructed. And then, but there's been no consideration for the investment strategy. So have you got that on your list? Then often the tax agent for the fund gets the details of it later, and they're sitting there going, oh, I need a new investment strategy because this no longer accords with the scenario. Has one been done? Like all of those sorts of things. So it's just, again, for awareness to make sure that along the way, all of these things have been ticked off on, because some people might be heavily involved, at the coalface at the time, and others might be picking up on it later. And so just double checking that collaborative approach for everyone, have we ticked all the boxes along the way to make sure that the fund remains compliant and there's not going to be any audit issues or other bits and pieces that need to be looked at later.
So the checklist is an absolutely brilliant idea, I think, just to reinforce what you have to do and whether or not you've actually done it. And to chuck in a Star Wars reference, to me,
Oh, I like it.
that's a real Yoda moment, isn't it? That's a
Mm,
real do or do not. There is no try, because there
yeah.
is no try
Checklist
with
or
these
not
things. Yeah,
checklist, there is no
exactly.
try.
And do those actions or
Yeah.
not. There's no, oh, I tried to, but I couldn't. I couldn't make it work. No, no, no. This is absolutely do or do not. There is no try.
And the other thing that we also encounter is sometimes, so again, just that collaboration happening. So it could be that the members of the fund or the fund it was a do-it-yourself fund, or they could have an investment portfolio that's managed by an investment advisor, but then they could have some unlisted property trusts that are independent of that. There could be, properties all over the place. So who's really got overall carriage of, it's almost like project managing that payment, because back to what we were talking about earlier, the SIS regulations require an interim and a final lump sum. Now, practically, that is very, very difficult to actually accomplish. And the reason for that is, well, there's multiple reasons for it, but one of the reasons is that whole leftovers concept that I mentioned earlier, because the whole fund, what happens in the whole fund over the course of the year is going to impact what the value of dad's account was at any point in time of a payment happening. So that, because it impacts the tax position in dad's account. And then the other thing with that is if you're looking at paying out multiple assets. So sometimes, and probably, I don't know if it's, I don't have the stats, talking about stats today. I don't have the stats that says that people just flog the assets and then transfer the cash out, or they just transfer in specie. Most deeds these days, I haven't seen one in recent times that doesn't allow the payment of benefits in specie. Sometimes it's just easier. You get the off-market transfer forms done by the broker, sign one, off it goes, and those get transferred out. Now, is that a single lump sum? And the answer to that is likely no, it's not, because there's a lot of guidance out there that says that if it's a portfolio of shares that gets transferred out, even if it's on the same day, all together in a single piece of paper, then that's unlikely to be a single. So that's not going to be an interim lump sum. That'll be 10 interim lump sums. And so the basis for that back in 2012, which I appreciate is now I'm feeling old now, 13 years ago. Back in 2012, the tax office brought out a couple of, there was a ruling about single acquirable assets from an LRBA perspective. So, I mean, we're talking it's the wrong way around, because that's getting money, sort of acquiring an asset in the fund, and we're talking here about transferring asset out. So there was a ruling back then that went through, because we had a change in 2010 with the LRBA rules were 67A and 67B. So you could have a borrowing for the acquisition of a single acquirable asset. What is that in the context of shares? If I buy a parcel of shares in one of the big banks, is each share in a parcel of 1,000 a single acquirable asset? So I'd need 1,000 borrowing arrangements. Yeah, that sounds practical. Or is it, well, I bought 1,000 shares in the same company and the same class of shares. Does that tick the box? And the tax office's ruling was, well, if it's the same class of shares in the same company, that is a single acquirable asset. So that was one element. And the other one, back in the context of different rules again, contributions going in, was ATO Interpretive Decision 2012-79. And I did look this up before we had our podcast. I don't know that one off the top of my head. I did try. So that was in the context of the fund capped contributions, which don't exist anymore. But the consideration there was, if you made a single one-off contribution into super, and that by itself was in excess of the non-concessional cap, you could basically flick out the excess and reject the excess. So again, in my scenario, if it was 1,000 shares in a company, was that a single one-off contribution? Was each share that of those 1,000 a single one-off contribution? Or if that was in a portfolio of, say, 3 shares that were transferred at that time, were on a single day, was that a single one-off contribution? And again, the tax office in that ATOID said it's the same company on the same day shares, so the 1,000 in my example. So if we flip that around for a payment out, sorry, I'm talking a lot now, but I love the sound of my own voice. So if you flip that around to a payment out, then multiple share transfers, even if they're on the same day, would be multiple payments.
Yeah.
Take a breath,
So,
Jemma.
so basically, the tax office established the principle with the LRBA. And yes, there was a lot of debate at the time, I still remember, as to what a single acquirable asset would be. I think they came down with a strict interpretation without it being completely unworkable.
Impractical. Yeah.
But having said that, it is a strict interpretation. So as Gemma says, uh, applying that principle to, say, an in specie lump sum death benefit payment, if you had, even if they're all ordinary shares, if you had Westpac and if you had BHP, there'd be two completely separate things. It can't
Yep.
be like they say that even if it's ordinary shares, which is obviously the same class of share rather than preferential shares, it can't be of two organisations. So in the LRBA context, you would have to get 2 loans if you wanted to buy those 2 different bundles of shares within the 2 different organizations. And they've just carried that forward, obviously, to the way it applies to the payment of death benefits. So for once, we're not actually going off piece, completely off piece.
Not too much. Not too
It's
much.
actually
Yeah.
relevant to
Mm.
the principles that you must take into consideration if you are looking to pay out your benefits like that. And of course, back to your original point, that has implications of you're limited to two lump sum payments
Mm,
only, which then becomes completely impracticable because if you've got just a simple two bundles of shares, Westpac and BHP again, well, there's your two, and you do an in specie for both of them. There's your two
yep.
lump sums. Exhausted.
And then you've got nothing left. You've got no
Yeah.
leftover, no ability to do a leftovers. That's right. So it's one of those pieces of legislation or bits of the legislation that is impractical. And I have never seen there be a compliance outcome or issue that the tax office has raised on that. And I've also had a lot of auditors sort of say, look, everyone acknowledges that it's impractical and it doesn't work. And even though there might be multiple payments that come out, I've never seen an adverse sort of outcome of that. Now, that's not to say just take your happy time and pay out 100 different payments, but from the practical perspective of if it is a substantial number of assets that you do want to move in specie, then again, back to that, as soon as practicably, can you narrow those down to a period of time to just get those out. But sometimes also, I had one recently. We moved out a residential property. We had unlisted unit trusts, multiples of those. Then it was some listed shares that came out, like all of these things to satisfy a death benefit payment. And in the course of having to liaise with each of the trusts to get the movement, they had different requirements for the off-market transfer. So they all happened on different days, unfortunately, in the end. Then with some cash as well flowing out. So, it all happened different times, but it's all there's no mischief around it. It's just what happens in real life. Which that's from Bluey. Now we've moved on from Bluey, from Star Wars and
That
The
was the
Simpsons to,
Bluey.
to talking about Bluey. Um, so yeah, in real life, this is what really happens.
Now, I know that you did mention then that there's been no precedent, there's been no cases, there've been no case studies as to people being picked up for making more than one lump sum payment uh, in a death benefit perspective. No one obviously wants to be that test case
Oh,
either,
absolutely
Gemma.
not.
So but and to its credit, I think in most of these situations, the ATO is quite reasonable.
Yep.
If you flag the situation with them and say, look, can you work with me on this? I'm not sure how to approach it. Can you give me some guidance? But I would imagine that if you wanted to do that with, say numerous parcels of shares, which is a great example, you really would need to document the hell out of the whole
That's right.
situation to
Yep.
prosecute your case.
And I would also expect that even if the auditor did, breach you on it with the explanation of what happened, again, I would, if the tax, like that would be flagged by the tax office, there's a breach, it's been lodged. Okay, what was it? Oh, it was an ACR on at this breach of the payment standards because there was 12 payments out and you're only allowed two. Okay, well, it's been resolved kind of, well, it sort of hasn't. You can't resolve it because you've got two and you did 12. But it was there's no mischief there. The benefits were paid out in accordance to pay it out as soon as practicably in accordance with the overarching regulation. And so it's likely to be a low risk one of don't do it again, but you're unlikely to do it again because it's the person that's died. It would only be obviously if the next person died. So it's just, again, one of those. So that it's impractical and everyone acknowledges that. And I know that so if the Tax Institute, as an example, has been advocating substantially for there to be a change to the rules. Or even if a practical approach could be there could be a PCG or the like on. I don't know if we really want that. We would, we don't want to be prescriptive about these things to say, okay, well, it's not two payments, it's 10, or it's limited to this, because whenever there's that limitation on there, there'll be situations where that will still be inappropriate. So how do you manage what that looks like? and some of these assets you can't sell them, so they're illiquid, so you can't just cash up the fund and transfer the cash out with respect to some of these items. There's no market for them, so you just have to, or there's a limited market, and so you've got to transfer the asset out. So it's again the practical sides of things like that. But bigger fish to fry at the moment on the legislative front, obviously with our mate Div 296 in there, and payday super, all those sorts of things on the radar at the moment. A little, can we change this rule, which we'd like, but again, I'd rather look at the higher priority elements before looking at that particular one.
Yeah, I mean, and you talk about priorities. There's no doubt there's a challenge there, but you also don't want the situation where we're talking about this in 5 years' time,
Mm,
and you say that, oh, okay, well, the general practice, the accepted practice has been, yeah, I know we're only limited to 2 lump sums, but as long as you can prove that there's no mischief, it's kind of been accepted practice to be able to do that. But the last thing you want to do is have, and I don't know how this would eventuate, but have somebody challenge this in court. And we know how many challenges there are over death benefits.
mm,
That's a situation that only seems to be climbing, not decreasing. But then you have a ruling, and then all of a sudden this becomes a little bit iffy and unwound, and a little bit like the wholesale investor test.
mm.
We're in a pickle basically because a
Where
blind eye
our
was
guidance is
pretty,
so
yeah,
wide.
yeah,
Yeah,
and the
that's
blind eye
right.
was turned to an interpretation that wasn't necessarily accurate if you
But it was
apply
practical.
strict,
It was
yeah,
practical.
yeah,
Yeah.
but it wasn't the strict interpretation of the law, which is why and I know I'm getting off the subject here, but which is why you can't really challenge AFCA's position now because they are applying the strict letter of the law,
Mm,
and you can't really say that, well, actually, no, you've interpreted this incorrectly. They're actually not.
I
So
agree. They haven't. They've, yeah.
so getting back to this, you don't want the situation to be like, oh yeah, we've been doing that for years because that's how it was considered acceptable. Only to have a court challenge or something like that and say, oh no, this is all unraveling before our eyes. So it is really important, even though, as you say, that there are other priorities and bigger fish to fry. It's certainly not something that I think should be allowed to just continue on ad infinitum without being addressed, because it will come unstuck. You know it will.
It
It's
will, and I think if the consideration there it will be if those payments are made over multiple financial years. So, but again, that's in real life. Practically, sometimes that's what needs to happen because until you've finished. So, let's say Dad died at the start of a particular financial year, or it's this time of the year. So we're nearly at Christmas. Should be wearing my no, not quite wearing my Christmas hat, but anyway. So we're nearly at Christmas. Dad dies at this time of the year. It's not, you might be able to say, okay, well, we've estimated pretty well what his accumulation account might be. As soon as practicably, we've paid out $1.9 million of back to my original scenario if he had $2 million in accumulation phase. We've paid out 1.9. It's been in multiple things, but we've still got a final payment that needs to be made because we're waiting on a transaction to settle because we actually have put the property on the market. So we're just waiting for that to sell and then settle, and then we'll pay out his balance. We've left enough leeway in there for tax, all of that sort of thing. So once we've calculated that, then we'll pay it out later. But the calculation of that might not happen until the end of the 25-26 financial year. And even then, you're not necessarily going to know exactly what the figure. So say 30 June 2026 comes around and you're like, great, okay, now we can run some more numbers, but then you've got to do the financials for the fund to really land on Dad's final payment. So you've got to wait for the tax reporting to come through, and then it is just before Christmas 2026 that you get the tax reporting. And then you're like, great, okay, so at 30 June, Dad's remaining balance, factoring in the CGT on that payment, was not 100,000, it was $88,500. So That's the amount we had to pay out at 30 June. Now we've got, okay, well, it's 6 months later. What's that 88,500 worth? It's been attributed with its share of the returns of the fund for the year. So you can see where this leftovers approach practically in real life comes through. So I feel I don't want to make a mountain out of a molehill here, because again, from a pragmatic perspective, the tax office has been incredibly pragmatic. I've never seen them have an issue with it. I agree that it is something that we don't want to just be floundering on it forever, because at some point that side of thing needs to come through. The challenge of it, like from a litigation perspective, I can only see that happening with the tax office, because they might look at it and say, look, Jemma, you did take the PISS with your fund because it took you 10 years to pay out, that payment. Was that really as soon as practicably? So I can see that they might have an issue with it there, rather than it being beneficiaries litigating because it's multiple payments coming out. Anyway, it's just an awareness for if you're doing the financials for the fund. Obviously, the limited number of payments you can make, the better. But it's just something to be, again, put it on your checklist, make sure that it's considered, and be aware that the audit might come back and say, look, it was 10 payments because each share transfer was it. And then, but again, like you said at the some point throughout our conversation about documenting it. So in accordance with the SIS regulation 6.21, lump sum payment need to be made as soon as practicably. These are the payments that were made. These were the dates. These are the tax components of it. All of that is documented for the purposes of the fund.
In your experience, Gemma, has this restriction of two lump sum payments actually deterred people from taking a certain course of action when they're dealing with death benefits, because they're aware of this restriction and they say, oh, look, if that's the case, let's do something else?
So sometimes I haven't seen that be the consideration. Often people, when we're talking about these sorts of values, and so if both mum and dad died, then unless there was an eligible beneficiary to start a new pension, which is probably unlikely in a lot of events, all that money has to come out. And so if you're then just basically paying out all of the assets of the fund to the estate of the survivor, then if you're doing that in specie, that could be tens of assets. So, that's just life in terms of, again, in real life. Now, the fund could decide to do at that point is liquidate as much as possible and just pay the cash over. But even then, I would expect that the cash coming out is going to be more than two payments, just with tax and leftovers and the like. And then if the estate is subject to dispute, you've got those considerations as well. So because you're required to pay out a lump sum at some point, then usually that's the catalyst. Where I see, again, it's almost the flip side. People aren't looking at that interim and final lump sum as a restriction on payments. What they tend to do is, what I see is people say, oh, I have to pay a lump sum out of dad's whole benefits of $4 million because the pension wasn't reversionary. Like that's what I invariably see more than I've got to make sure I'm paying no more than two payments. And so in that situation, it would be, well, let's look at the deed. What does the deed require? The deed says you can start a pension if it's non-reversionary. It doesn't have to be reversionary, right? We can start a pension for mum, etc. Not we have to, because we've got to pay these payments, we're going to do it differently. The only thing that might sway that is, oh, okay, we've only got a limited number of payments, or doing off-market transfers is too hard. Let's just flog everything and pay out the cash.
I know that there is that prescriptive element of two lump sums. Is the intention of that then to facilitate the scenario that you just painted, then to basically liquidate the assets in the SMSF and as close as possible, facilitate as few lump sum payments to the estate as you might be able to do, because that would almost, sorry, the intent as I see it would almost put that in a neater bundle with a bow on top of it.
Well, I can't remember the actual like history of the piece of legislation because it has been around, since Adam was a boy from the perspective of super, and it just hasn't really kept pace with the modern day fund operation. So like the big funds can do it. They just like their systems are built from that perspective to be able to say, okay, well, Gemma's died and her account as at today is X, pay it out in cash, and they liquidate the assets and pay it out in cash. Like that's how they work. But again, self-managed super fund land, it's just slightly different. And I think again back to the history of it, like one of the motivations behind it could be, well, of course you just sell everything and then you just pay out the payment. So there'd be no reason. You might pay an interim payment to the beneficiaries so they get some money up front, and then you do a final one once you've like you would do in an estate. So a lot of times in an estate, you make an interim payment to beneficiaries and then you finalize stuff and you pay it after that. So, it mirrors that a little bit, but again, it's not so modern in terms of how funds often like these days can operate, especially with respect to in-specie payments and transfer.
Yeah, what a surprise, Gemma. The legislation hasn't kept up with the way that the industry has evolved. Gee, I
Oh,
can't
so
think of other
surprised.
I can't think of
What?
other examples where that might be happening.
Oh,
Yeah,
only about
yeah,
1500. Yeah.
yeah. It's just a thought, but yeah,
Yeah.
that
Just a
does
thought.
it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Are
Yeah.
there any other sort of strategic, I don't know, considerations or recommendations or suggestions that you might have around this topic as to what practitioners and their clients should do in these situations?
So the biggest, again, it's awareness. Awareness is key to understand what this looks like. The sooner you can try and get in front of it, the better. And we're seeing more like our aging population. We are seeing more and more people. The consideration might be, look, mum and dad, or look, dad, you're the survivor. So see how I killed mum off first there. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
So dad, you're the survivor, but you're now 89. You're do we start, is an SMSF still appropriate for you?
Mm,
What assets are in there? When you die, all of the money is going to have to, all of these assets are going to have to come out. So what's the plan with that? Do you start looking at, okay, well, there is still a big chunky property in there. What is the succession intention with that? Do you consider, preempting that? Is that putting that into a trust? Now, stamp duty is a consideration, obviously, from that perspective. So there's all these other things. The other thing that I would, and this is where you've got within yours, as soon as practicably sort of benchmarks or flags that you've got to consider, is there an opportunity to look at, okay, well, we can wait till the new financial year and pay out that lump sum and try and optimize our ECPI. How might that timing work? Like those sorts of considerations. So again, being aware of, which assets are we moving? What's the CGT on those assets? And how they all interact. And so that's really what the important element is that the interaction of all of these concepts together, and what's trying to get the best outcome then for, well, the fund, which then ultimately benefits the beneficiaries.
yeah, yeah. That whole picture concept again,
Mm, yep.
but it's not as easy as it rolls off my tongue like that.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and on that, you might say to dad, okay, you're 89. This is what's going on. And he might be like, well, I did want the property to go to Jimmy because he's running the business, but then I'm adjusting these people here, here, and here. Okay. It's like, that's great. But you might be like, well, let's pay out that property to Jimmy or whatever. But then it's really important that you look at everything overall and say, okay, well, there could have been a binding nomination in the fund that dealt with an equalisation of assets in some way, or the will dealt with those assets in a particular way. And now by preempting all of that estate planning that was done is now just gone to pot. So again, it's important that it's that overarching holistic look at everything that might be impacted, and not just putting your blinkers on only in your lane,
Yeah.
and going down that front.
Yeah.
So yeah.
100%. Anyway, that's probably a good point to wrap it up, Gemma.
Yep.
So, as usual, we've had so much fun. We've run out of time.
Yep.
But thanks, Gemma, for
Standard.
nerding it up again for us
Yeah.
today.
We love a good nerd. Yep. Thank you for having me.
Oh, well, love doing these podcasts. It's fantastic. As I always say, we hope that the people out there who are listening to this, watching this, will enjoy it as much as we enjoy bringing it to you. Of course, thank you very much to SMSF Property Valuations for their continued support of these sessions. Thank you also to my team for producing these sessions and uploading it on all of the mediums that we do. Thanks again to Jemma for her time in Perth. It's actually a bit of a pain for Jemma, and I really appreciate her time because in the stupidity of all the time frames in this country now, she's 3 hours behind Sydney time, which actually makes the coordination of this a little bit more difficult and a little bit more arduous, because it usually means she's doing this very early in the morning, which
Not too bad, but yeah.
yeah, it's still pretty bad, and it's certainly not something that I would particularly warm to. So big thanks to you for that. But most of all, thank you to you for your company. As I said, we hope you got a lot out of the discussion and that you enjoy listening to us nerd it up, as Gemma likes to say,
I love to nerd
as
it up.
much
Yeah.
as we enjoy bringing it to you. So thanks again, and until next time, travel safely and have a great day.
Thanks, Darin.